Hi, welcome back, everybody. Hopefully, you have been able to watch some of our other modules that we have had, but we are on Module 8, and you are here for the verbal de-escalation series that we have done. I am Stephanie Dye from the ISD, a special ed behavior consultant here, and also one of the TCI trainers for the county. I will let my friends introduce themselves as well.
I'm Stacy Hopkins Schrump. I am also a behavioral consultant in special education and also a TCI trainer. So welcome.
And I'm Missy Post. I'm an autism spectrum disorder consultant and also a TCI trainer here at ISD.
So we are excited to have all of you and excited to learn about the life space interview. I know we've mentioned it a couple of times on the other modules. So we are here to talk about what that is, show you some models of what it is, and kind of explain how to use it. So we are going to talk about a little bit what we're going to do today. In your email, you got a participant guide. So we have a picture of it here on the PowerPoint. And on that participant guide, it has the links to all of the other verbal de-escalations, modules 1 through 7. This module can be used as a standalone for the LSI, or you can feel free to work through the series through each module and get here. So whichever way you got here, we're happy that you are here. On the participant guide is also some links for some videos. So we are going to prompt you when to pause and watch some video examples and be able to process through with that. Also, there are some handouts on there, some example statements that you can use when you are practicing or doing the LSI, some different examples. So feel free to print those out if you want them, or save them to your computer so that you have them to reference. We're also going to look at some visuals for the LSI. Missy's going to walk us through some of that. And there's also a video modeling that for younger elementary age student. And then at the end of it is our Google form that we ask you to fill out to give us your sketches and know that you've watched the video. So we're going to reference this guide and hopefully that you have that connected and up and ready to go. We are then going to do a little review, kind of get us set up to remember where we're at and when we conduct the life space interview. We're going to talk about the life space interview, do a little practice, and then we'll be in closing. So hopefully you enjoy this and learn some new tools from it. So as always, you've probably seen this slide every single time. We really want to make sure that we're looking at what the goal of verbal de-escalation is. Why do we continue to come and make these modules and continue to talk through it? The whole goal this whole time is really to support. So we want to support environmentally and emotionally for the student to be able to reduce that stress and risk. Our goal is to be able to bring them back down to baseline so that we don't have an outburst, or be able to get them back down, and really that support. And that support comes in from the adult. And how do we help support that student? So that's, again, still our main goal. And we've been talking about it through all the other modules of really what that support looks like. And in order to support, we always have to start with ourselves and that self-awareness piece. And if you can remember, we did a whole module on the self-awareness and really asking ourselves what that 4 question is. We're not able to help support or do anything for the student without having ourselves in check. So that first question is, what am I feeling now? Checking in with ourselves. How am I in this moment? Again, it doesn't always mean we have to change it, but it's really checking in so that we notice that we can see where we're at so we can purposely respond versus react out of our own triggers and our own emotions when working with the student. Next, we want to figure out, what does the student feel, need, or want? We all know that behavior is a way of communicating. There's a need that's not being met. And if we put that lens on and say, what does the student feel, need, or want? We're able to help support the student by meeting that need. Next is, what is the environment? Like, what is going on that's affecting the situation? How do we scan that environment to figure out the best way that we can adapt that environment, or maybe even manage that environment to help that student? And lastly, based on these 3 things, how do I best respond? taking in all of these 4 questions help us get ready to respond in a way to help support that child. Hopefully this looks familiar to you. We have our co-regulation skills pyramid, and look at, we made it to the top. So we are to that LSI now. So we talked about the 4 questions, that foundation, our self-awareness, because it all starts with us. In module 3, we talked about active listening, that crisis communication, how to use those reflective responses, how to use our nonverbals and really communicate back that we are here for the child. We have our behavior support techniques that we talked about. There's 8 of those, looking at how to take the technique that matches the student's behavior to help resolve and support that child. Emotional first aid, looking at ways to help drain those emotions, clarify those events, keep that communication open so that the student talks it out rather than acts it out, and then remind them of the expectations. That goal is to really keep them in the program, keep them in the activity so we can continue moving on through the day and resolve that immediate crisis. And then lastly is that co-regulation, where we look at the different types of behaviors. We talked about the proactive and reactive aggression. We really looked at those 4 elements of potentially violent situation. If it's the target, trigger, weapon, level of stress, what can we remove to help make it so it doesn't turn into a crisis or into that violence behavior. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the LSI today, which is that top piece, and help us figure out what that intervention looks like. So the LSI is that part where we finally get to teach. So we have the 2 goals, right? So we've been talking about supporting for the last 7 modules. Well, this one is where we get to talk about teaching. How do we teach them what we need them to do? And we teach them by teaching them new coping strategies. If we don't teach new coping strategies, the child's going to continue doing the same thing over and over again. And so this is an opportunity, after we support them through the crisis, support them through any type of trigger or any type of behavior, that we can then now teach them new coping skills to help them respond differently. So on that stress model of crisis, we are looking at all the different phases. So we've gone through the triggering event, escalation phase, outburst phase. We've gone through agitation, aggression, and violence. So remember, when we get to violence, that's the time that we call for that crisis support team. As we come down into that recovery phase. So all underneath the entire bell curve is where we are supporting. We're supporting that child. We've talked through that. That's our main goal. Well, now as we get to teaching, our main goal of teaching is at that recovery phase, when the student is back to baseline. Because remember, when we are ingress, we are stupidest. So we have to remember that when we're at baseline, we're able to rationally think and talk through things more openly. So at that recovery phase, there's 3 options that we have for outcomes. So one of the options is lower abuser. So that means that we have actually reinforced the student's behavior. We have harmed them physically or emotionally. So a lot of times with this, if we provide shame or guilt, or we get into that power struggle with that student, and we put the student down and make them feel worse, that's that lower abuser response. So the next one is that no change firefighter, which is where a lot of us find ourselves a lot of the time, because due to time or resources, we're just so much trying to put out fires. Child starts to get triggered or starts to escalate. We're just trying to do our best to get them back down and get them back to class and back going. But what happens with that no change firefighter is we're not doing any teaching. We are running around all day long just putting out fires, and we wonder why the next day still looks the same. So in order to change that, our response that we are working for is being that higher, the educateur. So that means that we're actually teaching them a new skill. And the teaching piece comes through the LSI, their life space interview. So when we teach them new skills and process and work through what happened, that's when we're that higher, the educateur. And that's our goal when we get to that recovery phase, is really being that teach and teaching those new skills for that student. So as we transition, we are gonna look at how do we do that? How do we teach that? So Stacy's gonna walk us through that life space interview and how we actually teach that component and be the educator.
Yeah, so this is one of the most valuable pieces of all of these modules I think we've built up to this point, but now we really get to focus on, okay, this is post-crisis, where does the learning take place? So the life space interview, and we're going to break it down piece by piece for you. It really is continuing to support that student by having this. So we're still supporting, even though we're into that teaching piece. That's why it's so therapeutic, because we are doing this together still with that child, even though we might have just been through a really intensive incident with that child. This is something that we do together. That's why we still are being therapeutic at this point. It is a verbal sit-down interview that we have with that student, and it just gives that student an opportunity to continue coming down to baseline. And you'll see this quote on the slide, which I learned something else today. You can Google this person, Fritz Rettel. He's actually a child psychologist from Austria, did a lot of work in the United States at different universities, but he is the creator, the father of the life space interview. And it really came out of his work with children in residential facilities, really needing the support from staff, but not from a necessary therapist. Like, you do not have to be a clinical social worker to do the life space interview with the child. That's the beauty of it. The people that are surrounding this child in his or her everyday life, when they make sometimes mistakes, their behavior escalates, they don't make the best choices. This is just those people who are around them on a daily basis are able to provide the support to them to be able to learn from their behavior experiences. So let's talk about the goals of the LSI. The word normal means different things to different people, but really talking about returning the student to that normal functioning. Remember, we've just been through an incident with this child, and I say we because we are with them. This isn't just that the child had this intensive behavior incident. We experienced that with them. So we really need the goal of the LSI is really to try to continue to bring that student down to baseline so that we can have this conversation, but we kind of get to baseline as we are talking to the student. Sometimes these crisis situations, they've been very violent, and we still need to be able to let that student know that we are there for them and continuing to bring them down to baseline. When we talk about clarifying events, it's really important for that student to be able to share their point of view and not be judgmental, but really to kind of walk them through what happened and really learn that cause and effect between kind of what they're feeling and then what they end up doing. So in the LSI can be used, it doesn't have to reach the point of violence. Any sort of crisis situation where we have the opportunity after to teach, maybe it was an intensive verbal altercation, maybe there was some property destruction. It can be any of those things when we can use this LSI. That's the beautiful part of this interview. So then we have to talk about repairing and restoring that relationship. And that is probably one of the most important pieces of the life space interview. We may have been the staff member that could have been that child's target during that crisis situation. But again, we need to let them know that not only will we be there to support you when you are calm and you're doing well, but we're also going to be there to support you when you struggle. So, it's like, hey, we're going to get through this together. I'm still here to support you, even though we just went through something really difficult, because we are the people who are with these children and these students day in and day out. So you might think, well, it's just an interview. How does it have that level of importance? It just tells the kid we're still going to stick around. Even though it might be difficult for us as staff members, really asking ourselves those 4 questions, maybe even before we sit down with the child to make sure that we are in a right space to be able to do this interview so we have the impact that we want it to have. The second most important piece is teaching. This is the point where we can really use that real life in the moment experience to teach a child new skills. We're not talking about what happened 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago or last year or what might happen. Like, we're talking about what just happened and then what might we do differently next time. So that's the beauty of it, is just being able to use these real life experiences. And the last part is being able to reintegrate the student back into the program. Think about students that you know that when they go through a crisis, you just know their day is shot. They're not able to get themselves back together. Some of them go home. Now, we do have those students that sometimes just need a break. Think about you in your own adult life. Sometimes you just need that too. But how powerful is it that a child will learn, I can have this struggle, I have the support to get through it, I can learn from it, but I can also stay in school. Now these behaviors, many of our kids have learned these behaviors over time. So just doing the LSI or the life space interview one time isn't going to result in a behavior change, right? There's other things we're also doing with these children to teach them new skills. But even if they have a struggle, even if they escalate into a crisis, to be able to learn that I can have these sometimes pretty significant kind of horrible moments, but that I'm able to, with the help of other people and just what I'm doing as a student to grow, be able to stay in school. So that becomes really, really powerful for them. So what does the LSI actually look like? You have some materials in your participant guide that will point you to when it's time to watch the role play. But for now, these are the steps. We do have those materials for you that describe what each step, like kind of what I'm doing right now, entails, and sentence starters and things like that. So don't feel like you have to write all this down. There's a lot of materials around this in your participant guide. So the first thing you want to do, a crisis has just occurred and we are now out of crisis, but that doesn't mean we're all back to calm. So just kind of isolating that conversation and finding a space, to go with that student. I wouldn't ask, do you want to do the LSI right now? Because they might say no. And Missy will talk a little bit later about what happens when they do say no, but just saying, hey, is this a comfortable spot for you to be? Is this a safe place for you to be, to have this conversation? We don't want to put the student in a situation where they feel like people can hear the conversation. We want them to feel safe in this conversation. The next step, the exploring the student's point of view, is probably the longest. And I think this is where people tend to rush through and skip steps, because when we're just starting to have this conversation, like the student's thoughts are just starting to become logical again. And we want to make sure that we get kind of the details of what happened in the event. And it really is asking them, so hey, tell me about what happened. Tell me about what was going on in there. Some sort of sentence starter like that. And they will start to tell you what happened. The most important piece here, and I think it was module 3, is where we talked about active listening. You're really listening to hear their thoughts, their feelings, what triggered them, and what actually happened in that particular event. So it's a lot of reflective responses. Like if a kid said, yeah, when he came in, he laughed at me. Oh yeah, so you were kind of embarrassed when he laughed at you. They're not going to look at you and say, why are you repeating everything I say? That's a really important part of active listening. So if you feel that's a skill you need to work on, because that is a skill that is needed for the life space interview, feel free to watch module 3, just the plug for that one. But as you're going through this exploration, even putting it in chronological order, okay, so first this happened, okay, and then next this happened, and you're really going through that event step by step with that student, because sometimes you weren't there for the first part. So it's completely okay as the adult to say, well, when I came in, or when I was called, like I came in and I saw that the classroom had been destroyed, or whatever it might be, because that might trigger some more thoughts or feelings that student experienced during that event. So just making sure that along the way, we try to really honor that student's perspective and their point of view, but also making sure that they have like the correct perception of what happened. So by you saying, well, when I came in, this is what I saw, versus maybe what they told you they felt or experienced, really coming together on that to make sure we have an accurate perception of what happened, and needing to be careful. You're not going to look at the kid and say, well, I know that didn't happen because I was here and I saw it. No, we have to talk through that and use that reflective responding to really get an accurate picture of what happened. And then to make sure we've got it, we move on to that summarizing, the feelings of what was going on in that situation and the behaviors that we saw, and just kind of rehashing and just repeating, not everything they told you, but just a shorter version to make sure we didn't forget anything, and to make sure that student feels like we've heard what they've had to say and that we have an accurate picture from them of what happened. The connecting the feelings to the behavior is probably the most important part of the life space interview, other than that student feeling like you've really listened and heard them, is really, this is why you have to listen so well, because you need to be able to connect whatever triggered that behavior or whatever triggered those feelings that then led to the behavior. So you might say something like, so when your peers laugh at you, that's the trigger. You feel embarrassed, that's the feeling, and you hit them. It's very specific as to what happened in that situation. But in order for that child to learn from that and learn about, okay, the next time I feel embarrassed, what should I do instead of hit? It's really important that you tie that together. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to associate their triggers to their feelings and their behaviors. So that's a super, super important piece that if we miss it, we're not going to be able to move on and talk about what to do next time. So just making sure that you really connect whatever triggered that behavior to that feeling to that behavior. And you'll see a really good illustration of that in the role plays that you're going to be seeing. The next part is also super important. So they're all important, but discussing those alternate behaviors. So this is the point where, okay, we've put it out there. We know what happened this time. And maybe it's a student you've worked with and this has happened repeatedly. It is okay when you're connecting those feelings to the behaviors and say, yeah, this has happened a couple of other times too. That's okay to do that here, because odds are we may have already worked on some alternate behaviors. But again, we're kind of talking about this incident. So the next time, people laugh at you and you feel embarrassed, what could you do differently instead of hitting? And it really needs to come from the child. Now, if they sit there and say, I don't know, I don't have anything. If you've worked with a child on something before, like breathing or, leaving the situation or taking breaks or asking for help, you can cue them and say, well, remember, we had talked about maybe asking for help from an adult. It's okay if it's something that you've previously done with a child, but the idea of what they should do differently really needs to come from them. We're fixers. You don't want to go in there and say, well, I think you should do this, and I think this would work really well. They need to come to that conclusion on their own and figure out what they could do differently in that situation next time. And then once you figure that out, the fun part, even in high school, even high schoolers, is that you need to role play it. You can't just talk it out, because if you don't practice it, you won't really know if it's going to work. Because there have been times where the child or the student has come up with a great idea of something to do. And then we go to role play it. And then they're like, yeah, that's not going to work for me. Or as the staff member in the role play, I might say, how's that really going to work? And then you can tweak how it works. There's all kinds of tips and tricks. If they're resistant to role playing with you, you can say, hey, how about you play me and I play you? Kids at certain ages love to play the teacher. And it's also fun to play the student, and then obviously switch roles and have them make sure that they role play and kind of talk through what that's going to look like and sound like when they do that in real time instead of just in practice. And the last part is entering that student back into the routine. That's the whole goal of this, is we want them to be able to stay in school and form those relationships with their peers and just learn that they can go through a tough situation and still stick it out in school. And we're going to talk a little bit more after you watch the role play about what that re-entry looks like, because we have to consider Is the student going back to a class that's their least favorite? What's the risk of re-triggering that student? Do we have some other things that happen during that crisis situation that we might need to deal with? And no, I don't mean punishment and suspension. I might like repairing relationships with other people that were involved, other conversations we need to have. So those are things that we'll talk about in a bit. And the one thing before we pause to give you an opportunity to watch the role play and practice is people always ask us, well, who should do the LSI with this child? It has to be someone that was directly involved in the crisis situation. This is not up, she just went through a crisis, we got to send her to the counselor or the social worker to talk through this. That's the relationship building piece. That's repairing the relationship of the person we may have actually harmed during a crisis situation. So it really needs to be someone who was involved. And yes, you need to make sure that that adult who's doing it is ready to do that with the child as well. And Missy's going to talk about some pitfalls of the LSI here in a little bit. So we're going to get a chance to watch a role play right now with Stephanie and Missy. And there's a couple different video examples in your participant guide, but we really want you to watch video example 1. And then, like I said, there's an observer sheet in there, and that's A108. There's a link right in the section of the participant guide that says LSI. It gives you kind of the chronological order of the steps, and also gives you some, and the LSI statements, A109, also gives you some sentence starters for when you are able to do this in real time with a student. If you're watching this with a group of people, what we would like you to do is watch the role play and then practice with a partner. Even if you're watching it as an individual, go find somebody later and have, process through an incident with them using the LifeSpace interview. Now, granted, you may not have experienced that with them, but just to give yourself some practice. So go ahead and pause the video right now and then go to your participant guide and watch that video example 1. Okay, so hopefully you were able to practice that. And I think the more you go through that with students, or even adults maybe, the better you'll get. And even as a clinical social worker, I have to say I was a little, I want to say critical, maybe apprehensive of using it, thinking, well, I'm a trained clinician. I know how to speak to students. I'm a school social worker. But you don't want to therapize the child at the time. You really want to repair that relationship and teach new skills. And you don't have to be a clinician to do that. And I think you'll find a lot of value in what you'll see as a result of the LifeSpace interview. So that re-entry back into the classroom, we often hear, well, they just re-escalated when they walked in. Well, number one, oftentimes it's because the LSI wasn't done. So that's step 1. And yes, there may be times where it's not possible to do it right after a crisis, whether it's, you just need to make sure you do it upon re-entry, whether that's the next day because they got sent home, whatever it may be. You have to make sure that student is back to baseline. I mean, if they're a willing participant in your role play with you, if they are willing to do those things with you, I mean, they're following some directions, it probably shows you that they're back at baseline. But there might be some things they need to do. They might still be really sweaty and gross. I mean, maybe they want a new shirt. Maybe they're thirsty. I mean, they could get a drink and do all those things even before the LSI. Maybe they missed lunch. Maybe they're hungry. Like, those are all the things that we need to think about before sending that child back to class, even just meeting their basic needs. There may have been another student involved or another staff involved. There may be a whole class of kids that are sitting there really fearful right now because of what just happened. So there might be some other work that needs to be done, not necessarily by that student, but by the staff who are supporting that student to make the environment safe for that student to return to, and making the environment feel safe for everyone else. If you aren't that child's teacher, if you're not the one who made that plan with the child, whatever new skill they're going to try, when they're experiencing those triggers and those feelings, you really need to go to that staff member and say, hey, this is what we decided to try, and make sure that everyone is on board. Because if the child goes to use that new skill and they're told, no, you can't do that right now, or I didn't know anything about that, you've just undermined the learning that you did with that child, and you could also re-escalate that child. So really, and in that moment, maybe that teacher is like, yeah, I'll try it, but I don't know if it's going to work. There might need to be further conversations, after, to really make sure the teacher is on board with everything, or the other staff are on board with everything. And I think it's really important, as we are talking about the purpose of the life space interview, is as difficult as it may be sometimes, we really need to make sure that staff and the student understand that this is a fresh start. When the student walks in to say, well, I don't know if I should ask you to do this because the last time I did, you tore my room apart. Like, we can't do that. Like, it's a fresh start. Remember, they're trying those new skills, and we need to be the ones who are positively reinforcing those new skills with them. So I think the more you utilize the life space interview with the kids, the better you'll get at it. And you don't have to sit down and say, okay, we're going to do the LSI right now. It's just a natural kind of conversation, making sure that you hit all of these steps and all of these points to make it an effective tool. So I think right now we're going to have Missy talking about potential pitfalls, because we always get asked the question, what happens when the child refuses to participate in the LSI, or some of these other variables that might prevent us from going through the LSI.
All right, so I'll share my screen so I can toggle through. So the potential pitfalls of the LSI, yes, in the role play example that you saw, we really wanted to give you a clean example so that you could see the LSI steps, but we know that in the real world, sometimes some things arise that can be challenging going through this process. So we want to talk about what some of those pitfalls can be, and then think through some ways to overcome any of those challenges. So we're going to first talk about if the student refuses to talk, because the LSI really is that conversation with the student. It's that collaborative conversation. So when we're talking here about a student refusing to talk, it's really a student that would have the skills to talk and process through, but isn't in this moment. Towards the end, I'll talk about if a student maybe has some receptive language challenges or expressive language challenges, how we can use visual supports to help them have that collaborative conversation. But here we're talking about a student that could have that conversation, but they're refusing to engage in it. So, first thing we want to always think about that we're bringing the calm to the situation. So we ourselves want to bring that calm, making sure that we're asking ourselves those 4 questions. We know that, when we're doing the LSI, it's not something that we had planned on doing in the course of our day. And so a lot of times we're in a crunch, right? We're trying to fit it into an already busy day. But if we approach it as, all right, let's go, we got to get through this, that's not going to convey that calm. So we do need to make sure that we're in that place that we can allow for time. We can allow that time for silence, giving students some extensive pauses if they're not responding right away. Sometimes the pause can even be stepping away for a bit and say, I'm going to give you a couple minutes, okay? So that they can feel more comfortable to chat. At this moment, if a student's refusing to talk, it may be something that we need to reassess. Are they really back at baseline? If not, we may need to give a little bit more time, okay? Also, if a student is refusing to talk, we can ask a little bit more of a focused question. So, like what happened first when you entered the lunchroom? If it was an incident in the lunchroom, or what happened first in art class? Through that, we can develop a timeline with students. So, first when I entered, the lunchroom, this happened. Okay, then what happened? What happened next? So we could even sketch this out for students to kind of help them through that process. With that, if they're still not talking, we can share what we saw first. So maybe I came in the situation, when I walked into the lunchroom, this is what I saw. What happened right before that? What happened right after that? Okay, that can kind of help give the students that scope. When we get to things that happened before, we might uncover some of those setting conditions that maybe made that behavior more likely to occur. So it's really that process of discovery with students. So some of those focus questions, that timeline can help with that. And then if a student is still refusing to talk, we can look at rescheduling the LSI. So we do want it to occur as close to the incident as possible. So it's really fresh in everyone's mind, in the student and staff members' mind, and they can really make that connection. But we also need the student to be at baseline and to be able to participate in the process. So if we do have to reschedule, that's something that we can look at doing. Okay? So that's if a student is refusing to talk. There are some ways that we can work to try to overcome that. Another pitfall that we sometimes see is a student gets off subject. So we're talking about an incident in the lunchroom, and then they start talking about recess the day before or something at home. Initially, what we really want to do is allow that exploration of what they're trying to say, because there may actually be some connection to the incident. When they're talking about recess, there may have been something at recess the day before that happened also with the student that they had the incident with today. So when they kind of seem to get off subject, we still want to use our active listening, those reflective statements, and see if there is a tie to the incident. Sometimes it might be a tie of they had all of these other things going on. So in summary, it's like you had all of these other things going on, at home before you even got to school. And then you got into math and this happened. So see if there is some relationship to the incident. Really, if you did the active listening module, we know that people want to feel seen and heard. And so, even if we think the student's off subject, we do want to practice that active listening and see if there is a connection, right? If a student is really off topic and we're not seeing that connection, or they're just talking about something more, we think as an avoidance, talking about, what they're doing after school or, after some active listening, to reflect that, we can still bring it back to the issue at hand, and say, I see that you really want to talk to me about, your plans for this weekend. And I do want to hear that. But first, let's talk about what happened in lunch today. Okay, so we can bring it back to the issue at hand. Okay? And if we say, I'll talk to you about that later, making sure that we honor that and follow through. Okay. And the last pitfall that we're going to really talk about here is the fixing it pitfall. Really, the student or staff just wanting to fix it is something that we can see. So sometimes, especially if students have went through the LSI multiple times, they might want to skip the early steps and just come up with the solutions, right? I know all those things, but next time I'll just do this. Next time I'll just take a breath. Next time I'll just take a walk, okay? We don't want to interrupt the student's thought process. We want to actively listen to that if they just want to go right to solutions. And then we want to bring them back. Okay, so we'll hold on to those as possible strategies, but let's look back at what happened so that we can see if those strategies would be a good fit, okay? So we don't want to say, well, that's not the step. We want to honor that they're coming up with strategies, but making sure to go back and see if see that connection between their feelings and behavior, so they start to understand those connections, because that's a really essential part of the learning process as well. Okay, so that's if the student wants to jump right to fixing it. But also as educators, oftentimes we just want to fix it. We know some strategies that the student has been working on, and we think if they tried those, that would just solve it. And we, just want to get to that element. But knowing when we get right to fixing it for students, we are taking away that learning for them. This is really essential learning for regulation in their future. And we don't want to steal that opportunity from them. So, we're not going to be with our students when they're 30 in a grocery store and things don't go their way. We're not going to be with them, in their home, with their family one future day, right? So we want them to have these skills to reflect and process through challenges, think of what might work better for them, so that they have these skills. So when you maybe catch yourself trying to go to that fix it, you can just remind yourself, like, I don't want to steal this opportunity for my student to learn how to process through challenges. Also, we know that, when the students develop the plan, there's oftentimes more buy-in, and the students would be more willing to participate and to engage in the process. Okay. We aren't just having the student come up with the solutions and then we have no give and take in that process. It's a collaborative effort, right? So if we see holes in what the student has come up with, we can ask questions to try to help support their solutions. It's not us just sitting back and they select anything like, next time Sammy takes my ball, I'm just gonna ask for a Mountain Dew and that'll solve everything, right? That most likely wouldn't work, so we can walk through and help them find a better fit, okay? So it's not just only the students choose anything that they think it's collaborative, and we can work through that, okay? Also, students may select a strategy, and once, when we're doing the actual planning of it before the practice, we might need to help. They might not have thought of certain elements, like the logistics of it. If they're going to take a break, we might have to ask, well, how would you let your teacher know that you're taking a break? So we can help process that. So we're not developing the plan for students, but we're helping them develop. When we have students who are younger or maybe less verbal, we do have some options of some visual supports that could help this process for them. The big key when we're adding visual supports to help students is that these visual supports aren't like a think sheet that we give kids that they independently do, okay? This still needs to be collaborative. We don't hand this folder game to a kid and they just go through and put the pieces where it goes and then check off, you're good to go back to class. That's not the LSI. The LSI requires it to be collaborative, that we're doing this together, right? It's that teaching piece. So even if you're using these visual examples, you're going to want to make sure that it still is that give and take. It's still a conversation, but it's just supported with visuals. So you're going to, in a moment, get to watch an LSI with visual supports, so you can see that it still is a conversation. And also on your participant agenda, you will see that you have some examples of the LSI visuals that you can use for reference. Also, there is a visual example of an LSI lanyard that you could print out so that you always have the steps, okay, and then the different examples. So I'm going to show you those different examples before you watch. So this one here, this one is not editable, but if you needed to create some additional visuals, you could just add the same color background to it. Everything is color coded to just help with the process. Here are the steps to the LSI here, and then the cards that you would print for students. So that's one example here, and usually on like a file folder. We also have this processing sheet, still not like an independent think sheet, so make sure that we're not thinking of it like that. It's still something we would do with students. With this one, you can see it still goes through the steps, what happened happened next. So, this is that precursor, what was the trigger, then the behavior, then what zone was I in? What was I feeling in that moment? So if you use strategies like zones of regulation, you can tie that in. I was in the red zone. How were you feeling in the red zone? Angry. right? So you can tie some of those other things that you're using with students in so that they can see that connection with that pre-teaching that you're already doing on self-regulation, social and emotional learning. So this also has a perspective taking piece. So if you have a student, you know, I'm an autism consultant, a lot of students with autism are going to have some difficulty with perspective taking, right? So how does my behavior make other people feel? That might be an added component, okay? And then this is that, you know, entry back in. Another way that we can do it. The last example that you'll have on there, and this has lots of different examples, this is editable. And there's lots of different ways it can be set up. You have kind of this blank one that you can use these pictures to create what you need. So not every student is exhibiting all kinds of behaviors. So you would only include the behaviors that you would most likely see with that student. So maybe they run away, but they don't ever spit or bite. So you might not include those in there. This one, if your student uses something like zones of regulation, you might pull in the zones feelings because that's something that they would already be readily able to identify. It might help them understand the process. Okay. If your students use something, especially with young students, the conscious discipline, you can pull in those those feeling cards. Here are the conscious discipline breaths. So when we're talking about strategies of what I could do next time, maybe it would be taking a balloon breath or a drain breath. So pull in what the students are already knowing. And so there's lots of examples, everything's editable, moving around there. The example in the role play is one that we set up kind of like a flip book. So it's set up like this, and each page is each one of the individual questions. So that just kind of helps if having all of the pieces on one paper, on one chart is too overwhelming. So with this, you would have what happened and then just the images of those behaviors, right? Why did it happen? Just those emotions, okay? And we made it like a flip book. Actually, I have it down here. I know it's, oh, maybe it isn't reversed, but it can be set up kind of like this, okay? Now with this, you might have some students that having several would not be overwhelming, or you could cut out and only have, you could have less options, depending on if it's student specific or maybe a whole class, what you might have on that flip book. So it's just something that you would go through, process with the student, and it might be more supportive for them. Okay. So you'll have access to all those visuals. It can help with students who maybe if I'm asking them those questions about what happened, they're not really sure what's even being asked. Maybe receptively, they're not understanding my words. That gives them some visual support to understand the question, but then also gives them that visual support to express to me if they might not be able to say an answer, or to give some choices. So right now on your participant agenda, there is role play video 2, younger student example. We'll ask that you watch that now so that you can see the LSI being done in less of a detailed conversation. The first example where I was the student and Stephanie was the teacher was definitely a more in-depth conversation. For our littles and our less verbal students, you'll see that this can look much different. So we're going to go ahead and have you pause now, watch that example, and then we'll come back. Okay, so hopefully with that example, I was the staff member and I walked through the process with Stephanie. You might have students that need more scaffolding, might having to give 2 or 3 options instead of a page of options. Or a student that might be able to, once we give them those visuals, they might be able to expand a little bit more with their verbal output. Okay? But we just wanted you to see that the LSI, even our students that have less communication skills, can participate in this process. Thank you. Oops, there we go.
Thank you, Missy and Stacy. Well, um, thank you for you guys coming and learning about the LSI. I know a lot of people hear about the life space interview and what does it all entail. And I think it's a good point that Stacy made that anybody can do this. It can be anybody that has been in the situation with the child. It doesn't matter level from principal to, instructional assistant, parapro, any of that can be anybody that does that. And it's just really making sure you go through the process and go through each of the steps. And it's really powerful when done. So, and congratulations on completing module 8 of our 8-part series. If this was your first one you watched, awesome. Hopefully it intrigues you to go back and watch some of the other ones. If you started with 1 and ended on 8, awesome. We're so proud of you. And hopefully that you got some opportunities to put more tools in your toolbox and understanding all of the process. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us as well. So what's next? Please fill out that questionnaire that is on your participant guide so that way you can get your sketches and get credit for that as well. And again, we want to thank you so much for watching all of these and coming through the modules. They will continue to be on repeat on Learning Stream each year. So use them as refreshers, use them bits and pieces to say, hey, I want to learn more about this again and dig into for that as well for you. So again, thank you and we'll see you later.